Hmm. Mike, similarly, a question came in. I think that it's asking, well, how do you judge a historical document to see if what it says is true or not? And, we're kind of trying to get it like, well, if we don't have the autographer, how do we know? Well, let's just take the documents historically. Now we're not looking at photographer. You've kind of answered that question, but we are talking about what we do have. What are some of the criteria that a historian uses to judge whether or not a document is true or not? And I'm going true or reliable or what, but that's a question this person brought up.
Yeah, well, let me say this. First of all, there is some pushback on the criteria today, a more recent movement on this, maybe within the last 10 years. And there had been all along with some of this. And I think some of it is because when the criteria had been uh, laid out in the past, it was almost like they were laid out to be surefire things, almost like, hey, a scientific thing, you can put these things in a test tube and if it comes out this way, you can have mathematical certainty. And it was just never meant to be that way. This is just common sense criteria. The more that you have weigh in this favor, the more likely it is that we're going back to an authentic saying or an accurate recollection of something Jesus did. So these would just be common sense things. So we're going to put more weight, more value on a testimony that comes from an eyewitness or a testimony that is rooted in eyewitness testimony. Okay. So if we are hearing a story about the Battle of the Bulge from one of the surviving soldiers who fought in the Battle of the Bulge, that's eyewitness testimony. If this guy's wife relays the story that her husband had told her, and the husband, let's say, is dead, it's still rooted in eyewitness testimony. So we're going to put more value on that than if it's several generations removed. We're going to put value on a testimony that's given very close to the event it's purporting to describe. So we're going to put a little more value on a testimony that's given within 5 years of an event, more weight than we would something that's given 70 years later. But what about if you have something 70 years later or 50 years later by an eyewitness? Actually, the World War II was over 75 years ago. So what if you have a World War II veteran telling a story 75 years later, right now? We're still going to give because it's eyewitness testimony. But we'd prefer if it was an eyewitness telling us 2 years after the event, right?
Yeah.
We talked about the criterion of embarrassment. That's an important one. If it's given by an unsympathetic source. So like in politics, we've got a congressman here in Georgia, where I live, who's a Democrat and said he's going to vote for Donald Trump in the election later this year. Well, that's kind of like an unsympathetic source who is endorsing you. That's a little stronger than if someone in your own party is endorsing you, right? So if you've got, like when we have Tacitus, the great Roman historian, who was actually hostile toward Christians, and he reports about Jesus's execution by the Roman governor Pontius Pilate. Well, that's going to have a little more weight to it than if you have a Christian that is reporting something, right? For Paul to say that the risen Jesus appeared to him is a little more weight than if a Christian, a disciple, said that he appeared to him after his death. So using these kind of common sense criteria, we come to sayings of Jesus in the Gospels, his teachings, and we see, are there sayings of Jesus that are multiply attested? Attested, that's not to say like Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, because remember, Matthew and Luke are using Mark as their primary source at times. So if it's found in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and it's almost verbatim, as some things are, well, then it's not three separate sources. It's one. It's Mark. It's two sources using Mark. But if you got like Mark and John, that's multiple independent sources. Or another kind of criterion would be recurrent attestation. So, for example, you've got Jesus predicting his death and resurrection on a recurrent basis throughout the Gospels. So even though the sign of Jonah is reported in Matthew and Luke, in basically what we would call the Q material. Either they're using a common source, or Luke is using Matthew, or Matthew using Luke. You're still looking at one source there. So it's only attested by one source. But then you've got John chapter 2, where Jesus says, destroy this temple and in 3 days I'll raise it. There's, something where he's predicting his death. Or Paul in 1 Corinthians 11 in the Eucharist things, where he's talking about his body, which is broken for them, his blood, which is shed on their behalf, the new covenant. You have to have a death in order for the new covenant to take place. He's predicting his death. Or Mark chapter 9, where Jesus predicts his death, and that's where Peter rebukes him and Jesus calls him Satan. That's only mentioned in Mark, I think. And so you got recurrent attestation. So we look at things like this to verify the probability that Jesus actually said these things. And some things, of course, are going to be, we can have greater historical confidence. Now, if you're just coming to the Gospels and saying they're divinely inspired, you can believe you believe it all. But we're looking at this as historians. You're asking me, right? What this person's asking me, what can we prove with reasonable certainty? Of course, not absolute certainty. What we show to be more probable than not that Jesus actually said these things, that Jesus actually did these things. This is the kind of stuff we use criteria like this, and we compare hypotheses to see which ones will best explain the facts. And so that's kind of how historians work to verify numerous sayings and deeds of Jesus in the Gospels.
That's good, Mike. I think that that's going to be very helpful for our listeners as well. I mean, these are things that you can be mindful of, even if you're not a scholar, that if you find yourself wrestling with something and how you're going to try to go through a process, here's some of these criteria, and you can run things through a process that might help you. Again, not from a magisterial approach, like the Bible's guilty till proven innocent, but just being informed and wanting to learn.